Hey, I'm back. The second segment that is covered is how did the Industrial Revolution impact World War I? What various inventions and innovations were made that really caused World War I to be what it was? The first one of them is the machine gun, this rapid firing rifle that really cost human life. And it really is what caused the belligerents, belligerent is the participant in a war, to engage in trench warfare. Prior to World War I, armies would just sort of line up and engage one another in battle with one-shot, like musket-type rifles, not very accurate, very long time, like 1 to 2 minutes to reload. And then that's how wars were fought. World War I, you had this machine gun, so now, you rapid fire, several hundred rounds, per minute or per second. And so you couldn't just line up your forces. You had to do something different, and what they did was trench warfare. They dug these big trenches, long, hundreds of miles, and in between the trenches was called no man's land, and they would pop up and fire at each other. Just an interesting method of war. Airplanes were first used. The Wright brothers in 1903 took their first flight. In World War I, planes were first used just for information gathering. They would fly over and find out where the enemy forces were. But then they became active actual war machines when they installed machine guns on them. And it's an interesting development on how they overcome the propellers, because they didn't have jets then. They had propellers, so they had to invent different ways of allowing the guns to fire without shooting off their own propeller. First, they installed little deflector wedges on the back sides of the propeller, so when the bullet round would fire and hit the propeller, it would ricochet off, but that wasn't always effective. And eventually they developed a timing mechanism, so as this propeller was spinning, the rounds would fire only in between the spaces of the propeller. So you can imagine the technology that went involved in that. So it's pretty impressive for early 1900s. Other innovations were radio communications, tanks, chemical weapons, chlorine gas, and mustard gas were used in the war. So soldiers had to wear gas masks, this cumbersome and heavy, awkward equipment as a result of chemical weapons being used for the first time in war. You had wrought iron and cast iron cannons being used in ironclad, steam-powered ships like the USS Maine. Okay? You had increased gunpowder, steam-powered trains used to transport troops and supplies in between the various fronts, the eastern and western front of the war. And probably the most influential innovation was the German U-boat, which was a submarine. It played a critical part in the U.S. entering the war. When you listen to me reading the first, or the primary source of Wilson addressing Congress, he talked about the U-boats and unrestricted submarine warfare. You need to know what that was about and how it impacted the U.S. policy. Germany, when they first launched the U-boats, they engaged in unrestricted submarine warfare. Basically, they would declare that any ship that sails into the waters that they were controlling and wanted to control, they would just sink it without warning, without any opportunity of negotiation or saving the sailors on board. They would, and people on board, they would just sink it. And then they realized that this was causing a bunch of backlash, so they kind of pulled back on that. But then you saw with Wilson's address, he talked about the Lusitania, which was a passenger ship that they sank. They returned to unrestricted submarine warfare. And when they did this, it really angered the U.S., which prompted us to get into the war, along with the leak and publication of the Zimmerman Note. And remember, if we tie this back to the Spanish-American War, if you remember the Delome letter with McKinley in Spain, how that impacted public opinion and ultimately spurred the U.S. into entering the Spanish-American War. Okay. In the slideshow, you'll see this diagram of her map of Europe. You'll see the Triple Entente, and the Central Powers, and the neutral countries at that time. So that's basically our second subtopic, which was inventions and how they impacted World War I. So you might want to create yourself a bubble chart of those as well, so you can remember that in case you're asked to write up something to that effect.